All right, so you're deep into moral philosophy. You've explored Kant, wrestled with utilitarianism, but maybe you're feeling like something's missing. Like those big systems don't quite capture the messy reality of actually making ethical choices.
Yeah, there can definitely be a sort of disconnect there.
Right. And so today we're diving into William David Ross. He offered an alternative, a way to think about ethics that embraces that complexity.
Exactly. He was a philosopher working in the first half of the 20th century, really a key figure in what we call deontological ethics.
Okay, so remind me, deontology, that's all about.
Deontology focuses on duties, rules, the rightness or wrongness of actions themselves.
Right, right. So how does Ross fit into that?
His big idea was that we've got multiple fundamental duties, not just one overarching principle, and he called these prima facie duties.
Prima facie, I've come across that term, it means.
At first glance, basically. But it's a bit more nuanced than that.
Got it. So we're going to unpack all of this, figure out why Ross challenged the big names like Kant and the utilitarians, and see why his ideas are still relevant today. And you brought the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Ross, which is perfect.
It's a great resource.
Awesome. So where do we even begin with a guy like Ross?
Well, it helps to understand his background. He was born in Scotland in 1877, but spent some of his early life in India. Then he studied classics, Greek and Roman stuff, first at Edinburgh, then at Oxford.
Oxford. Such a hub for philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. And Ross became a fellow at Oriel College there, had a really distinguished academic career.
But his interests went beyond just ethics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard his name connected with Aristotle.
Definitely. He was actually a leading Aristotle scholar, translated key works like the Metaphysics and Nicomachean Ethics, even edited this big Oxford translation series of Aristotle.
Wow. So he was deeply immersed in ancient philosophy, but also carving out his own space in moral philosophy.
Exactly. He also did a lot of public service, served in World War I, had roles in government, knighted in 1938. It's amazing how he balanced all that with his philosophical work.
It really is. But it's his ideas on morality that we're here for today. So what was his starting point? How did he approach ethics?
He begins with what he calls the data of ethics. Basically, he says the starting point is the core moral convictions of thoughtful and well-educated people. He compares it to how scientists use sense perceptions as their data.
So he's giving weight to our considered moral beliefs, the stuff we kind of intuitively hold to be true.
Right. And this is where he differs from someone like Henry Sidgwick, who thought the goal of ethical theory was to systematize and correct common sense morality.
To make it all neat and tidy, even if it means overturning some of our ordinary beliefs.
Exactly. But Ross, while acknowledging that we can be mistaken, he argued that we shouldn't just toss out these convictions, especially not for some overly simplistic theory.
So when should we question our moral beliefs, according to Ross?
He says we should only reject them when they clash with other, more strongly held convictions. The ones that have really stood up to scrutiny. And he points out that a lot of ethical errors come from what he called media axiomata.
Media axiomata. Break that down for me.
Basically, it's like the rules of thumb we use in moral reasoning, not the fundamental beliefs themselves.
Okay, so our basic moral compass is sound, but the application can get messy.
Right. But he also said that looking at the historical origins of our beliefs can reveal some are just outdated remnants of old systems. That kind of analysis could lead to some big revisions.
That's interesting. He seems to appeal to both the educated and the everyday person's intuition. But do those always agree?
Good point, and it's something philosophers have debated. If those judgments clash, and Ross leans towards the educated view, then maybe he's more reformist, like Sidgwick, than he admits. But ultimately, the strength of his approach depends on the specifics of his ethical framework, which we're about to get into.
Okay, let's do it. So, why did Ross feel the need to create his own ethical framework in the first place? It seems like he wasn't too happy with the dominant theories of his time, Kant's ethics and ideal utilitarianism.
You got it. He thought both of them were oversimplifying the moral life. They didn't capture the true complexity of our moral experience, the stuff he considered the raw data of ethics.
Let's start with Kant. What were Ross's main issues with him?
One big thing was Kant's idea of exceptionless moral principles. Like Kant famously said, lying is always wrong, even if it could save someone's life.
Right, the classic murderer at the door example.
Exactly. Ross, he's like, come on, common sense tells us there are times when lying is okay, especially to prevent harm. He felt Kant was too focused on these abstract rules and missed the details of real situations.
So for Ross, context matters. Morality isn't just blindly following rules no matter what.
Exactly. He also disagreed with Kant's idea that only actions done out of duty have moral worth. Rice thought things like love and genuine care for others also matter morally. For him, it's not this battle between duty and our inclinations.
They're more nuanced than that.
Way more nuanced. Okay, now, for ideal utilitarianism, those folks like Moore and Rashtal, Ross had a few bones to pick with them, too.
Lay it on me.
Mm-hmm.
What didn't he like about their focus on maximizing good?
First, he thought it oversimplified moral deliberation. They said the only thing that matters is maximizing good, period. But Ross pointed out that when we think about keeping a promise, for example, the fact that we made the promise in the past, that holds weight too, maybe even more than some future benefit.
It's not just about the future consequences. Our past actions matter morally as well.
Precisely. Second, he criticized them for basically saying the only moral relationship is that of benefactor. But Ross is like, hello, we have all sorts of relationships, debtor, parent, friend. These create specific duties that can't just be reduced to maximizing good.
Like, I owe you money. Even if donating it would do more overall good, right?
Right. He's emphasizing the moral importance of these unique connections. And you can see the influence of earlier thinkers here, like Butler and Price, who also had issues with utilitarianism.
And of course, his deep dive into Aristotle probably played a role too.
Absolutely. All right, so Ross rejects Kant's rigidity and utilitarianism's single-minded focus on good. This brings us to his own framework, his ideas of the right and the good.
Okay, so how does he build his own system?
His famous book, The Right and the Good, that's where he lays it all out. He proposes a bunch of fundamental moral requirements and intrinsic goods, and there's no single principle to rule them all.
Sounds more like the real world, right?
Yeah.
Multiple things mattering at once.
That's the idea. So let's start with the right. This is where his prima facie duties come in.
Right, those duties at first glance. But we said it's trickier than that.
It is. So he gives us this list of 5. Fidelity, reparation, gratitude, beneficence, and non-maleficence.
We need those unpacked.
Of course. Fidelity is about keeping promises, reparation is making up for wrongdoing, gratitude is returning favors, beneficence is promoting well-being, and non-maleficence is avoiding harm.
Okay, I'm seeing a pattern. These are all things we generally consider morally important.
Exactly. But here's the catch with prima facie. These aren't absolute duties that dictate our actions in every single situation.
So they don't automatically trump everything else.
Nope. Think of them more like strong moral reasons or responsibilities. They all contribute to figuring out what we should ultimately do.
Like the fact that I promise something gives me a reason to do it, but maybe there's a stronger reason not to, based on another duty.
Precisely. And another thing that's misleading about prima facie is that it might sound like these duties are just apparent, not real. But Rouse was adamant that they point to objective facts about the situation.
Like if I break a promise, the fact that I should apologize, that's objectively true, regardless of how I feel about it.
Exactly. He sometimes compares it to tendencies, like an action that helps others has a tendency to be right because of beneficence. He also talks about them as responsibilities, reasons. This was a huge step in ethical theory, offering a way to handle those tricky situations where our duties conflict.
So how do these basic duties explain all those other rules we have? Like not lying or obeying the law.
He says those can be understood in terms of the prima facie duties, like not lying connects to non-maleficence because lying can harm, and to fidelity because communication often has an implicit promise of truthfulness.
And obeying the law, that could be gratitude for the state's benefits, or a kind of implicit agreement, or even beneficence if the law promotes good.
Exactly, you're getting it. And another thing, Rose believed these 5 duties don't all have equal weight.
Some are stronger than others.
He thought so. Non-maleficence, avoiding harm, that's usually stronger than beneficence. Doing good, like do no harm, trumps do good unless the good is really huge compared to the harm. And he also thought duties from personal relationships, those are usually weightier than beneficence. Like keeping a promise to a friend might outweigh some general good you could do for strangers.
It's about the strength of that specific connection.
Exactly. He doesn't give a strict hierarchy, but it's generally understood that non-maleficence often trumps the others when serious harm is involved.
All right, so we've got these duties. They can conflict. Some are stronger than others. How do we actually figure out what to do in a specific situation?
He says the right action, what he calls our duty proper, is the one with the greatest balance of prima facie rightness over wrongness. We look at all our options, see how they align with or violate those duties, and basically do the math.
The moral math.
Right. He gives that example of choosing between coffee with a friend and helping accident victims.
Yeah.
Coffee is fidelity, but helping is beneficence and maybe even non-maleficence.
And most people would say you got to help those in need.
Right. And Ross agrees. The rightness of helping outweighs the wrongness of breaking a minor promise.
But it seems like his thinking on duty proper evolved a bit, didn't it?
You're right. At first, in The Right and the Good, he kind of saw duty proper as the starting point and prima facie duties as explaining it.
Then he flipped it.
In a way, yeah. Later, in Foundations of Ethics, he seems to see those prima facie duties as more fundamental, like they're about what's fitting in the situation. Our actual duty then comes from weighing those basic obligations.
I can see how this idea of multiple basic duties, not just one principle, might ruffle some philosophical feathers.
Oh, definitely. The ideal utilitarians, they weren't fans. They wanted that nice unified theory where everything comes from one principle.
They'd say Ross's system is too messy.
Too messy, not systematic enough. And philosophers like Joseph and Rawls, they worried that without a clear way to weigh those duties, moral debate becomes impossible. They saw Ross's intuitionism as incomplete.
So how did Ross defend his pluralistic approach?
He basically said, look, I get the appeal of a simple system, but loyalty to the facts is worth more than a symmetrical architectonic or a hastily reached simplicity. Meaning, real life is complicated, and our moral theory should reflect that.
Don't force a simple answer where there isn't one.
Exactly. He even considered adding more duties, but then decided his 5 were enough to capture common sense morality.
And this clash with the utilitarians over promise-keeping, that seems like a key point of contention.
Big time. Well, Huss used examples like this one with Edward and James, where breaking a promise to Edward would slightly benefit James more overall. He said, most people would say you should keep the promise, even if it means slightly less overall good.
The utilitarians would argue that breaking the promise would erode trust and hurt cooperation, which are bad consequences.
Right. But Ross wasn't convinced. He thought they could always come up with some far-fetched case where breaking the promise seems to have a slight edge, and that just felt wrong to him.
It violated our sense of what a promise means.
Exactly. And then there's Pickard-Cambridge, who used some really clever thought experiments to challenge Ross, like the one with Chuck and Peter's violin string.
Remind me about that one.
So Chuck borrows Peter's violin and breaks a string. He promises to replace it, but then Peter's violin gets destroyed. Does Chuck still have to replace the string?
Seems kind of pointless now.
Right. And Pickard-Cambridge argued that ideal utilitarianism better explains that intuition. He had other examples, too, like a miser who makes a promise based on a lie, and a poor guy who wins the lottery after someone promises to help him.
So in those cases, our sense of obligation seems weaker.
Right. And Pickard-Cambridge said ideal utilitarianism handles those cases better. But Rudd pushed back, saying things like the promise was implicitly conditional or made under false pretenses.
Trying to reinterpret the situation to fit his theory.
You could see it that way. But the debate goes on. Some people think Ross's explanations seem a bit forced, and that utilitarianism can account for those intuitions just as well, maybe even better.
And then there's that final example, the one with the dying guy, A, who gives his property to B to give to C, even though D would clearly benefit more from it.
Yeah, that one really highlights the tension between keeping promises and maximizing good. Ross thought it was outrageous that utilitarianism would say B should give it to D.
But the Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out a potential problem for Ross here too, right?
Right. Ross himself said that the point of a promise is often to bring pleasure to the person you promised, but A is dying, so...
So maybe the obligation is weaker on Ross's own terms.
Potentially. It just shows how tricky these moral dilemmas can be. And the utilitarians, they tried to bridge the gap by saying things like promise-keeping and gratitude are good in themselves, not just for their consequences.
Trying to have their cake and eat it too.
In a way, yeah. But to fully understand that move, we got to look at Ross's own theory of the good, what he considered intrinsically valuable.
Okay, let's do it. What did he say is good in itself, regardless of consequences?
In The Right and the Good, he gives us 4 things: virtue, knowledge, and true opinion to a lesser extent, justice, and pleasure. He even ranks them with virtue at the top, then knowledge, then it seems justice, and lastly, pleasure.
He was a big fan of virtue.
Huge fan. He even said no amount of pleasure could equal even a tiny bit of virtue.
That's a bold
It
statement.
is, and some philosophers disagree. They say, what about a world with a little virtue but tons of suffering, versus one with slightly less virtue but tons of happiness? Most would say the second world is better overall.
I can see their point.
Right. So in Foundations of Ethics, he revises his list a bit. Now it's virtue, intellectual and artistic stuff, justice, and the pleasure of others. And he makes distinction. Virtue and intellectual things, they're good in themselves. Justice and others' pleasure, they're good as objects of satisfaction.
So different kinds of good.
Yeah. And this helps him explain why he thinks only innocent pleasure is good, and why we should care about others' pleasure but not necessarily our own.
The idea that we don't have a duty to make ourselves happy, that's a pretty unique view.
Very unique. He argued that our own pleasure, from our perspective, isn't good in the same way that others' pleasure is a worthy goal. Same with pain.
So neglecting our own well-being isn't necessarily wrong.
That's kind of what it implies, and some people find that problematic. And the status of justice, whether it's a good or a duty, that's a bit unclear in his work.
So just like with his duties, his theory of the good has its critics too.
Definitely. Some question the strict hierarchy, why our own pleasure doesn't count, all that. And remember, the utilitarians, they tried to incorporate things like promise-keeping as intrinsic goods themselves.
To say it's good to keep promises, even apart from the consequences.
Right. But Ra'yi pushed back, saying only states of mind are truly intrinsically good and actions aren't states of mind. But then justice is on his list, and that's not really a state of mind either.
It gets complicated.
Ethics always does. Okay, so we've got Ross's framework of the right and the good. But how did he think we know any of this stuff?
Right, how do we figure out what's right and good in the first place?
He was an intuitionist. Basically, he believed we have this direct, non-inferential grasp of basic moral and value truths. It's kind of like how we understand math.
We just see that 2 + 2 = 4, we don't need a proof.
Kind of like that. He said it's not that these truths are obvious from birth, but as we mature and reflect, they become evident. We learn by seeing particular examples and grasping the general principle.
So we see that keeping promises is good in various cases, and we get the general idea.
Exactly. But how do we then decide what to do when duties conflict?
Back to that moral math.
Right. We weigh the competing considerations from all the relevant prima facie duties and pick the action with the strongest overall rightness. But he was clear that we can't be absolutely certain about this, only have a considered opinion. And even when a duty gets overridden, it still matters.
Like, if I break a promise for a good reason, I should still apologize.
Exactly. And what if two actions seem equally right? He didn't really address that directly, but it seems like he'd say any of the top contenders is okay in that case.
So no clear winner, any morally decent option works. But this whole intuitionism thing, that's been criticized a lot, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. People question whether we can be truly certain about those duties, especially since Ross himself seemed to change his mind on some things.
Like with justice, its place in his system was a bit fluid.
Right. And in some cases, our duty seems obvious, like saving a drowning child. That doesn't feel like just a probable opinion. And then there's the big problem of disagreement. People's intuitions clash all the time.
He tried to explain that away by saying people are in different circumstances or have different beliefs.
He did, but some disagreements seem way more fundamental than that. And it makes moral progress hard to measure. In science, we can track progress with evidence. But if it all comes down to intuition...
How do we know we're getting better, morally speaking?
That's the challenge. And some worry that Ross's reliance on common sense makes his ethics too tied to a particular culture or time.
What's right for us might not be right for everyone, or for people in the future.
Exactly. Okay, last but not least, let's touch on Ross's metaphysics. His view on what moral properties actually are.
Like, what does it even mean for something to be right or good?
Like many philosophers then, he was fighting against naturalistic definitions, those that try to define moral terms using non-moral ones, like happiness or societal approval. He also distinguished those from non-naturalistic ones, which use other moral terms.
So you don't like saying right means produces the most happiness?
Nope. At first, he agreed with Moore and Sidgwick that right is just a basic, undefinable thing. Later, he was open to defining it as suitable and good as admirable, but those are still non-naturalistic.
He had that interesting argument about disagreements.
Right. He said, look, if right just meant produces happiness, then debates between deontologists and utilitarians wouldn't make sense. We don't argue about definitions. We argue because we think there's a real difference.
Because we think there's something objectively true about morality, not just a matter of opinion.
Exactly. And he applied this to other definitions too, like saying right is what I approve of or what society approves of. He pointed out that we often think something is right even if others disagree.
So he wanted to preserve the idea that morality is objective and special, not reducible to other things.
Absolutely. He saw ethics as its own thing, with its own truths that we grasp for reason, not just observation. He liked the idea of these necessary and universal moral truths, not just something we invent.
Sounds like he believed in a kind of moral reality out there.
That's the standard interpretation. While he didn't explicitly commit to a whole metaphysical theory, he seemed to think moral claims express these special, non-natural facts. But he was more focused on how we know what's right and what our duties are.
On the practical side of things,
Right. And, Ross might seem old school in some ways, but as that Stanford Encyclopedia entry shows, people are still talking about him today.
why do you think that is? His ideas still have some bite.
Definitely. He offers this strong defense of pluralistic deontology, a real alternative for people who aren't satisfied with Kant or utilitarianism. And his prima facie duties, that's his most lasting contribution.
It's a helpful way to think about all the different moral factors pulling at us.
Exactly. And it's relevant today as we face all these new ethical challenges from technology and changing social norms. Plus, his focus on reflecting on our moral convictions, that resonates with people who think ethics should connect to our lived experience.
So to sum up our dive into Ross, we've got pluralism, prima facie duties as moral reasons, his critiques of the big theories, and this unique intuitionist epistemology. And he gives us a system that, for many, feels more true to the messy reality of making moral choices.
You nailed it. He offers this rich, nuanced picture of morality, acknowledging all those competing obligations and the difficulty of figuring it all out.
It makes you wonder, though. He was all about capturing common sense morality. But our world is changing so fast, new dilemmas popping up all the time. How would his framework adapt to that?
It's a great question. Which of our current convictions might be those prima facie duties in these new contexts? How do we weigh them against each other when they clash?
It's something to ponder as we wrap up here.
Absolutely. Ross might have been writing almost a century ago, but his ideas still have the power to make us think, and that's a testament to their enduring value.
Couldn't have said it better myself.